My name is Shamil, and I'm with Kavita, and we've been working together recently on a series of events with Dishoom to commemorate the 75th anniversary of Indian independence and indeed partition as well. And so in a way, we're going to talk a little bit about that, but as we do, I thought it was interesting to talk about maybe briefly some of the history behind things. And the 75th anniversary is pretty important and pretty special. And I suppose in the first instance, we're commemorating the struggle, the freedom struggle of independence and the long years that eventually led to the British Raj being finished and government, self-government for India and Pakistan beginning, democracies being born, people finding their voice. And those are all joyous things to celebrate. But at the same time, Pandit Nehru talks about the labour pains of freedom. And I think he's talking about partition and the fact that many people crossed borders. And I think at the time, 10 million people crossed borders, and maybe more than 1 million people were killed in that crossing at that time, and the violence that took place as a result of partition. And the history is known, which is in 1947, around March, Mountbatten appeared and was sent over by the British government, by the Attlee administration. In June 1947, he announced that partition and independence would happen in 73 days, which is remarkable, very quick. It was sort of very soon, 10 weeks. And by July the 8th, Cyril Radcliffe, a British bureaucrat who'd never, I think, set foot in India, arrives in India, and he has 5 weeks to draw the line. And that line determines destiny for the next many decades and on forever, perhaps. And in fact, the partition line was only published 2 days after the 15th of August, which is the anniversary of independence, or the date of independence. And as a result, shocking violence took place. And we talked about the 10 million people who traveled, we talked about the 1 million people who might have been killed, or more than 1 million people who were killed. There's also the statistic, which is pretty grim, that 75,000 women were abducted or raped or forced to convert at that time as well, which is, and these numbers are big numbers, but the human suffering that they talk about is incredible and enormous. So in a way, we're also here to talk about not just independence and commemorating that and the events that took place, but also some of the stories of partition. And during the events, we had people who had experienced it firsthand, and children of those people who had experienced it with us to talk about those things. So Kavita, tell me about some of your work. I know you've written the book, Partition Voices, and from that has come some of our conversation and some of the things that we did for these events.
Well, we met, didn't we, at a literary festival, and we're talking about this history that has, it's shaped so many of the lives of people living in Britain, because there are millions of people with South Asian heritage who live in Britain, and so many of them have a connection either directly or indirectly with partition. And I travelled around our country in 2017 for the 70th anniversary.
5 years ago, yeah.
Exactly. And at that time, the stories of people who'd lived through partition were really only just emerging. And you talked about those statistics between 10 to 12 million people on the move. I mean, the statistics are overwhelming. And it's worth saying that people left in a hurry. They didn't have time to take things. And this was homes that they'd lived in, or they'd been born in. Their parents were born on that land, their grandparents.
And disorganised hurry, not even a week's notice,
No.
people left.
And I think that the trauma of that, having to start a new life, people kept their silence in Britain for a long time. I know historians who tried to get people to open up. People weren't ready. And I have to say, I feel quite sad that it took that long, because 70 years is late. And I think a lot of testimonies were lost. I think a lot of families won't know what happened to their own families during that time. But people did start to speak, and they did open up, and the stories that I collected for a radio series, then for my book. And I hadn't quite appreciated before I started how these stories are everywhere in Britain, and we just didn't know. I mean, it's my family. I was learning more about that. I think it's your family too. And so, yeah, it's been very eye-opening. And I think that the 5 years since then has been very much an awakening within families that this is this is our history, and what is our history, and what does partition mean in our own family? And so you're absolutely right, the 75th anniversary is significant. It is joyful. People were happy after many years that the British left, but there is this enduring pain and loss that all sides feel and has kind of permeated down the generations. But what I'm interested in is that you run Dishoom. Lovely that you read my book, but you wanted to use the space of Dishoom to commemorate the 75th anniversary, but also incorporate the testimonies in that. Why did you want to do that?
I mean, the testimonies are interesting to me. Well, I think for me, the 75th anniversary was, and we met and talked about your book, and I'd read your book and was very moved by it, but somehow also, I feel that food and spaces like Dishoom, which are shared spaces which feed people, we can break down barriers with food. Food is a way of bringing people together, and I think we've always felt, and part of what we do is to pay homage to these old Irani cafes in Bombay, and without going into all of their history, they were shared spaces where people came together, whether they were Parsis who invariably owned the cafes, or whether Muslim or Hindu or Christian or Sikh or whatever it was, or prostitute or taxman or judge, or M.F. Hussein was always in an Irani cafe. And for me, that idea that food can be used to create understanding, and to combine that in the 75th year with something that I think is really important, which is the oral tradition of history. And oral history is something, history quite often is reduced to documentaries, sort of worthy black and white documentaries, or which I quite like, or books, or sort of thinking about the politicians and the big political moves. But somehow history is an oral tradition, brings it home. And when you hear someone like Mohindra Bhai talking about his experiences, there were people there, and the number 10 million disguises 10 million experiences, and it's unfathomable once you hear an oral history and say, well, that's times 10 million. Or a million deaths, or 75,000 women who are harmed in a brutal way, which I think must be an underestimate. But I think that to bring that together, to use food to create shared understanding, is really, really important to us. And I guess we do more of that, where we have big Eid events or iftars or Diwali, and I'm a Hindu, but I love celebrating Islamic events with Islamic colleagues. I think we will have to come together and celebrate and understand each other. And if we can use this event, the 75 years, to create understanding, then I think so much the better.
Because it's interesting, isn't it, when you listen to those testimonies, from all the testimonies we heard, it is quite complex, because of course there is that trauma, but they also remember a time where people lived side by side and were very happy. So you mentioned Mohindra, and I felt very honoured that he spoke to us and shared the story of him being 6 years old. It was his actual birthday when they had to flee Pakistan. And it's probably worth saying that his family had lived in Pakistan, I think, for generations. They were very happy there, and after partition was announced, they wanted to stay. His father wanted to stay.
I must tell you that my father was very, very devoted to the place where he belonged to. And because he was a government employee, they had given the option that you could work either in India or Pakistan, irrespective of your religion. And my father gave it in black and white that I want to stay in Pakistan. And mind you, partition took place on the 15th of August. And we did not leave till 13th of September. It was my grandfather who really fired him and told him, run for life, otherwise we were all dead.
And he made quite an epic journey, and they were lucky to live, he told us all. And it was really emotional hearing that story. But it was also interesting to hear how he talked about his father being heartbroken for the rest of his life that they chose to leave Pakistan.
To be ripped away from his earth.
Exactly, literally. And Mohindra became the first person in his family to go back a couple of years ago, and that was very meaningful to him, so meaningful in fact that he took a brick with permission from his old house, and he took it to Edinburgh, where he now lives, and it's kind of like
centerpiece,
it is a centerpiece on a on a table like this in a glass cabinet. And everybody talks about it.
There have not been any much growth in that colony. The same SDO office is there, but my house was demolished actually because it's too old, and I decided to bring that brick as a memory for my lifetime.
And why do you keep that brick in your living room where every single person who walks into your house will see it?
Yeah, because, I like to share my memories.
And he needs that. That's his connection to his
earthing.
His soil, but also that is his ancestral home. And, the legacy interviews were, I found very raw, because you can see that the trauma, even in silence, has seeped through the generations, but so too has this nostalgia for the place that was left. I mean, you must have found that with the younger stories. They were really moving.
And Benita, I found that they're, it was a different perspective, wasn't it? But maybe in some ways they were able to, they talked about some of the suffering and the events, maybe in some more detail than some of the older generations, but their attachment to the earth was equally apparent. If I think about, you've heard that from Sparsh many times, but the way he carries that soil around, literally on his chest, and he's lived in different places, but for him to be grounded and rooted with the soil that his family left is incredible.
I think it's really important that these stories are finally getting told, because it's not something that just happened 75 years ago and is history and we lock it up in a cabinet and, because like the way people live in the subcontinent today, the values they hold, especially towards members of opposing religious communities, even the word opposing kind of gives that away, but it's like a lived experience, it's a lived trauma from the partition.
Or even the way Benita was so excited to have her father give her father the soil again. It somehow comes back to earth, doesn't it? Somehow comes back to soil and where we belong.
It does, and it's something very elemental. And actually, I find it really hopeful, not only that partition generation talked about soil, but that has carried on down the generations too. But so too have those stories of people who lived side by side, who had deep friendships, but also people who helped, of the other religion, helped people survive. They may have been friends, they may have been strangers, and that has carried on too. And I think partition it was horrific in so many ways, but I think if you listen closely to that generation, they are telling you something very nuanced, and I think we should listen to that.
The younger generation, you mean?
Well, to what they say, but also what is carried on, because to me that is hopeful, that there was a time where people lived very, very closely together and religion was actually irrelevant. They had the same language, they had the same food, they had very similar traditions, and that was ripped apart. And you can feel that pain as well. And I think for me on the anniversary, of course we must remember that the terrible things that happen. You talked about those statistics, but we must also listen to what those people tell us too, and what that time was like in undivided India as well, because they remember that. And I think that does sometimes challenge the state narratives that we hear today.
I think very much. And I sort of worry that, well, they weren't, it's living memory, isn't it, still? And that's why we're discussing people telling their stories. It literally is living memories. It's only a lifetime ago, 75 years ago. And I think that we quite often, kid ourselves that we're different to the people from the past, but we're really not. We're the same as the people 75 years ago. And I don't know where that thought process goes, but I think we are like they are. And I don't know if that sort of thing can happen here or in some context, but we're the same people, and what happened to them, they were good people, that they were split and divided, and horrendous bloodshed took place.
But I want everyone to know this. This is wider British history, and I think that there are campaigns, for example, South Asian Heritage Month, really want this on the curriculum, and I think that to me is something in the last 5 years that has grown much louder, those calls, and I'm interested to know why you wanted music to be a big part of the evening, because it was celebratory, it was moving, it was joyful. And Shamik spoke really beautifully about his choices.
He's brilliant,
Why,
isn't he?
why did it matter to you to have it there?
I mean, music's always been a big part of my life, but I think that music, I think in a way, maybe we've evolved to respond to music, and music is a way to express shared emotion. We feel very differently when we hear a minor scale to a major scale. You know, music just affects us differently, and I think that music is a way to express very big emotions. And I think after those testimonies, to have Shamik come on and play music, which is from the different parts of South Asia. You know, he draws from different traditions, and he's a wonderful musician and a pretty amazing man. But to have that release the emotions and to be able to say, look, we've heard some difficult things, but this is a way we can sort of feel emotion together, was, I think, a lovely collective moment. And I think everyone who was there really responded to the music in a beautiful way. And at the end, then we were able to partake of food, which is, again, another place where we can all break down barriers. And both these things are properly borderless. You know, music and food have no boundaries and borders and shouldn't. And coming together over a table where there are food from different traditions, Muslim traditions and Hindu traditions and maybe Parsi traditions as well, I think that all goes together and creates more and more understanding and more breaking down of barriers.
What did you take away from the events, but also that 75th moment?
I mean, for me, so much of reading about partition and indeed your book is that sense of horror that comes with reading about what happened. It's horrific to be able to understand it, and the statistics hide the horror of it. And I honestly feel that we need to talk more about what happened, and we need to be ready to look at it and ready to say that perhaps we aren't so different, and how do we create shared understanding that these things can't happen again. And I think that, in a way, a sort of second, third generation people over here, as we're all a bit more secure here, we can look at the past a bit more. We can understand where we've come from, and I think it gives us great advantage to understand where we've come from, to understand where we are.
Yeah.
And I don't think it reduces my sense of Britishness. I'm quite a proud Brit, but I think I'd like to understand some of the history and to be able to look that stuff squarely in the face and be more comfortable about who I am in the context today.
But what I've noticed is with the third generation is that they are very secure with their place in Britain, much more secure than the second generation,
First
their
or second
parents.
generation, yeah.
And by the way, their parents weren't really asking their own parents about, you know, partition so much. So they are asking the questions, but they are comfortable with the complexity of their identity. They can say, I'm British, or I'm South Asian, or I'm Gujarati, Bengali, Punjabi, or I'm from Yorkshire or Leeds. And I think that their discovery of their own partition story might begin across a border from the one they thought their family came from. And I think that they're okay with that. And I think it's different if you're from the Indian subcontinent. Maybe it's a betrayal. It's harder to say, I'm from here, but I feel a connection with the place across the border. I think they're okay with that, and they want to understand their identity in all its complexity. And again, I find that really hopeful, actually.
I agree. And you know, thinking about this, understanding, it's only good, isn't it? I mean, I think that for me, the antidote to us feeling like, you know, that thought that we're very similar to those people and perhaps this can happen again, the antidote is understanding.
Yeah.
The antidote is looking at it. The antidote is understanding your history and understanding what happened and understanding how people can live together peaceably. And that is a good place to be, and we need to be very careful of the tendencies that point in the other direction. Kavita, that was lovely. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I've really appreciated the collaboration, and thank you for writing your book and all that you've brought to the surface. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and thank you for honouring these testimonies too.